Young millionaire placed camera in coffin of his lover, what he saw left him stunned. Welcome to Wise Stories. Please do remember to subscribe, like and share this video. Donald Reynolds sat on the edge of his luxurious leather couch, scrolling through an endless sea of emails on his laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated his face, but his mind wasn't on work. His eyes occasionally darted toward the kitchen, where Sophia stood by the window, her phone pressed to her ear. She spoke in hushed tones, her voice low but urgent. Donald frowned, setting his laptop aside. He had noticed a shift in her behavior over the past few weeks, small things at first. She seemed distracted, her once effortless laughter replaced by a faint, polite smile. The late-night phone calls had become more frequent, and every time he walked into the room, she'd end the conversation abruptly. "Is everything okay, Soph?" he asked, his voice soft, careful not to sound accusatory. Sophia turned, startled, clutching her phone tightly. Yeah, it's fine," she replied, forcing a smile. Her green eyes darted away from his, focusing on a distant point outside the window. "You've been quiet lately. Is there something you're not telling me?" Donald pressed, stepping closer. Sophia sighed and put her phone down on the counter. "It's just work," she said, brushing a strand of her chestnut hair behind her ear. "We're dealing with some tight deadlines, and it's been stressful. I didn't want to bother you with it." Donald searched her face, trying to find the truth in her words. "You sure that's all it is?" She nodded quickly. "Absolutely. Don't worry about me, Don. I'll be fine." But Donald wasn't convinced. He had known Sophia for years, and her cheerful, open demeanor had always been one of the things he loved most about her. Now, it was as if she had built a wall between them. A week later, the distance between them seemed even more apparent. Sophia stayed up late, pacing the living room while Donald pretended to sleep in their bedroom. He could hear her murmuring into the phone, her voice tinged with anxiety. When she finally came to bed, Donald turned toward her. "Who were you talking to at this hour?" he asked, his tone gentle but firm. Sophia froze, startled by the question. "Just a colleague," she said quickly. "We're working on a big project, and things are complicated." "Complicated how?" "It's nothing serious," she replied, brushing him off. "Can we talk about this later? I'm exhausted." Donald sighed, knowing he wouldn't get any answers tonight. He lay back on his pillow, staring at the ceiling as Sophia turned her back to him. The day Sophia collapsed started like any other. Donald was in his study, going over investment reports, when he heard a loud crash from the living room. Heart pounding, he rushed out to find Sophia lying on the floor, her face pale and her body limp. "Sophia," he shouted, dropping to his knees beside her. He gently shook her shoulders, his voice trembling. "Soph, can you hear me? Wake up." Her eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, filled with fear and pain. "Donald," she whispered, her voice barely audible, before slipping into unconsciousness. Donald's hands trembled as he fumbled for his phone to call 911. "Please, send an ambulance. My fiancé just collapsed," he said, his voice cracking. He gave them the address, then turned his attention back to Sophia. "It's okay, baby," he murmured, cradling her head. "Help is on the way. Just hold on." At the hospital, Donald paced the sterile white hallway, his heart racing. A nurse finally emerged from the room where Sophia had been taken. "How is she?" Donald asked, his voice urgent. "She's stable for now," the nurse said with a reassuring smile. "The doctor will see you shortly." Donald exhaled in relief, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He texted Sophia's sister to let her know what had happened, then sat down in the waiting area, his mind swirling with questions. What could have caused her to collapse so suddenly? An hour later, a doctor approached him, a clipboard in hand. "Mr. Reynolds?" Donald stood up quickly. "Yes, that's me. How's Sophia? Is she going to be okay?" The doctor smiled. "She seems to be fine for now. Her vitals are stable, and the initial tests didn't show anything alarming. We'll keep her overnight for observation, but you shouldn't worry too much. Donald nodded, relief washing over him. Can I see her? Of course, the doctor replied, leading him to Sophia's room. Sophia looked fragile lying in the hospital bed, her usual glow replaced by a pale, tired expression. Her eyes opened as Donald entered the room, and she managed a weak smile. Hey, you, she said softly. Hey, Donald replied, pulling a chair up beside her. He took her hand in his, squeezing it gently. You scared me, sophomore. What happened? I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I just felt dizzy, and then everything went black. The doctor said you're fine, but they're keeping you here overnight, Donald said, brushing her hair back. You're going to be okay. Sophia nodded, but there was a flicker of fear in her eyes that she couldn't hide. The next morning, Donald woke up in the hospital chair beside Sophia's bed. He had refused to leave her side. The nurses came in to check her vitals, and everything seemed normal. By the afternoon, the doctor gave them the green light to go home. I'm so glad you're okay, Donald said as they walked out of the hospital together. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, determined to take better care of her. But their relief was short-lived. That evening, Sophia complained of a headache and went to bed early. When Donald checked on her later, she was unresponsive. Panic surged through him as he called 911 again, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial the number. The paramedics arrived quickly, but their faces were grim as they worked to revive her. I'm sorry, one of them said after what felt like an eternity. She's gone. No, Donald whispered, his voice breaking. She can't be. She was fine just this morning. I'm sorry, the paramedic repeated, his tone heavy with sympathy. Donald dropped to his knees, his mind refusing to accept what was happening. He clutched Sophia's lifeless hand, tears streaming down his face. At the hospital, the doctor confirmed the worst. We're still not sure what caused her death, he said, his tone professional but distant. We'll need to perform an autopsy. Donald sat in stunned silence, his heart shattered. The woman he loved, the person he had planned to spend the rest of his life with, was gone. But as he stared at her still form, a nagging thought crept into his mind. Sophia's death didn't feel natural. She had been fine just days ago, and now she was gone. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, a truth he was determined to uncover. The funeral home was bathed in soft light, the quiet hum of muted whispers filling the air. Donald Reynolds stood motionless at the entrance to the main hall, staring at the casket resting on a raised platform surrounded by white lilies. His legs felt heavy, as if weighted by the enormity of the moment. He hadn't yet found the courage to approach. Sophia was in there, he thought, the love of his life, now forever still. It was a thought he could scarcely process. Finally, Donald forced his feet to move. He approached the casket, his heart pounding in his chest. The room seemed to blur, but as he drew closer, his vision sharpened. There she was. Sophia. His breath hitched as he looked at her. Dressed in her favorite pale blue dress, her chestnut hair carefully styled, she looked almost like herself, but not quite. Something was wrong. Donald leaned in closer. Her face, once so lively and full of warmth, looked strained. Her lips were pressed tightly together, and her brow seemed faintly furrowed, as though frozen mid-thought. Her hands, folded neatly over her chest, were unnaturally stiff, her fingers curled into a faint but noticeable clench. She doesn't look peaceful, Donald murmured aloud, though he hadn't meant to. A mortician standing nearby, dressed in a crisp black suit, stepped forward. Mr. Reynolds, is there something troubling you? Donald hesitated, then pointed to Sophia's hands. Her face, her hands. Why does she look like this? Shouldn't she look relaxed, at peace? The mortician offered a practiced smile, his tone calm and professional. It's not unusual, Mr. Reynolds. Postmortem changes can sometimes cause stiffness in the muscles. We've done our best to prepare her, but some things are simply beyond our control. Donald frowned, not entirely convinced. Her hands are clenched. That doesn't seem right. Is that normal too? It can happen, the mortician said with a slight shrug. Rigidity can set in during the embalming process, and sometimes it affects how the body appears. I assure you, there's nothing to worry about. But Donald wasn't reassured. He turned his attention back to Sophia, searching her face for something familiar, some trace of the woman he loved. Instead, he found himself haunted by her expression, by the way her body seemed to resist the stillness it had been forced into. He reached out hesitantly, his fingertips brushing against her cold hand. Sophia, he whispered, his voice breaking. As he stood there, memories of the last few weeks flooded his mind. He thought about how distant she had become, the late-night phone calls, the moments when she seemed on the verge of telling him something but stopped herself. She had been afraid, he realized now. Donald clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath his grief. Why hadn't he pressed her harder? Why hadn't he demanded to know what was going on? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of quiet conversation behind him. Turning slightly, he saw Sophia's family gathered near the back of the room. Her sister, Amelia, was talking softly to their father, her expression calm, even detached. Donald furrowed his brow. It didn't make sense. Amelia had always been close to Sophia, fiercely protective of her. But now, she seemed almost indifferent. None of them seemed as distraught as he felt. He approached them cautiously. Amelia, he said, his voice low, how are you holding up? She turned to him, her expression unreadable. I'm fine, Donald. Thank you for asking. Fine, he repeated, unable to hide his disbelief. Your sister just died, and you're fine. Amelia's eyes flickered with irritation. We all grieve in our own way, she said curtly. Donald looked to Sophia's father, hoping for some acknowledgement of the situation's weight. But the older man simply nodded, his face a mask of composure. Returning to Sophia's side, Donald felt a wave of unease wash over him. The funeral home grew quieter as visitors left, offering brief condolences before disappearing into the night. Soon, it was just him and the casket. He looked down at Sophia's face one last time, his mind racing. Something wasn't right, he could feel it in his gut. The strained look on her face, the stiffness of her hands, the calmness of her family. It didn't add up. A thought struck him suddenly, chilling in its clarity. What if her death wasn't natural? What if someone had caused this? He replayed the events of the past weeks in his mind, trying to piece together the fragments of her behavior. Who would want to hurt you, Soph? He whispered. And why? Donald's grief turned to resolve. He had to find answers. He couldn't let this go, not when everything inside him screamed that something was wrong. That night, as the funeral home staff prepared to close for the evening, Donald made his decision. He pulled out his phone and texted a friend who worked in tech security. Do you still have those hidden cameras you showed me? He typed. The response was immediate. Yeah. Why? I need one. Tonight. A few hours later, Donald stood alone in the dimly lit room, holding a tiny, high-tech camera in his hands. It was small enough to go unnoticed, with long battery life and night vision capabilities. He glanced around nervously, ensuring no one was watching, then carefully opened Sophia's casket. His hands shook as he placed the camera near the lining, ensuring it was well hidden but had a clear view of the interior. I'm sorry, Soph, he whispered, his voice trembling. I need to know. As he closed the casket, a sense of unease settled over him. It was a desperate act, but his instincts told him it was the right one. If there was any chance of uncovering the truth, he had to take it. Donald stepped back, his heart heavy. I won't let you down, he said softly. I'll find out what happened to you. I promise. The house was quiet, but Donald Reynolds couldn't find peace. He sat in his dimly lit study, staring blankly at the coffee cup in front of him. The past few days had been unbearable. Sophia's absence weighed on him like a crushing weight. His appetite was gone, and sleep was a distant memory. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, strained, lifeless, and cold. His decision to place the camera in her coffin haunted him too. Had he crossed a line? Was it truly necessary? These questions swirled in his mind until they were interrupted by the vibration of his phone. The notification made his heart leap. The footage from the hidden camera was ready for him to view. Donald hesitated, his fingers hovering over the laptop. Did he really want to see what the camera had captured? What if it confirmed his worst fears? Taking a deep breath, he clicked the file. The screen filled with grainy footage of the inside of the coffin. For the first few hours, there was nothing but darkness and silence. Donald fast-forwarded, his heart pounding as the hours ticked by. Then, something caught his attention. It was late at night, around 2 a.m., according to the timestamp. The camera picked up faint vibrations, followed by muffled sounds. Donald's brows furrowed as he leaned closer to the screen. The vibrations grew stronger, and soon the camera caught the unmistakable sound of dirt being shoveled away. "What the hell?" Donald whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat. A shadowy figure emerged, their movements hurried and precise. The person wore dark clothing and gloves, their face partially obscured by a hood. Donald's breath hitched as he watched the figure dig relentlessly, their shovel slicing through the soil until the coffin was fully exposed. The figure paused for a moment, looking around as if to ensure they weren't being watched. Then, with a swift motion, they opened the coffin lid. Donald's stomach churned as the camera revealed Sophia's lifeless body, still dressed in her pale blue dress. "What are you doing?" Donald muttered to himself, gripping the edge of his desk. The figure reached into their pocket and pulled out a syringe filled with a clear liquid. Donald's eyes widened in horror as the figure carefully injected the substance into Sophia's arm. For a moment, nothing happened. The figure stood still, staring at her as though expecting a reaction. Donald leaned closer to the screen, his body tense. But Sophia remained motionless, her body unresponsive to whatever the figure had injected into her. "What are you trying to do?" Donald whispered, his voice trembling. The figure leaned over Sophia, their lips moving as if they were whispering something. The camera's microphone struggled to pick up the sound, but Donald could faintly hear the words. "It's not your time yet. Come back." Donald recoiled from the screen, his heart racing. Who was this person, and why were they doing this? After a few minutes, the figure sighed and closed the coffin lid. They carefully shoveled the dirt back over the grave, erasing any evidence of their intrusion. Then, without another glance, they disappeared into the darkness. Donald sat frozen, his mind racing. His grief and fear were now overshadowed by a new, overwhelming emotion, anger. "This wasn't random," Donald said aloud, his voice filled with determination. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. He replayed the footage, pausing at the moment when the figure's face was partially visible. Though the hood obscured most of their features, there was something disturbingly familiar about their jawline and the way they moved. "I know you," Donald whispered, his eyes narrowing. "I've seen you before." Donald's thoughts spiraled. Was this a failed attempt to revive Sophia? Or was it something far darker? Had someone tampered with her body to cover up evidence of foul play? He felt a surge of guilt for not noticing the signs earlier. Sophia's strange behavior, her distant demeanor, the late-night phone calls, it all pointed to something she hadn't shared with him. And now, someone was going to great lengths to ensure her secret stayed buried. Donald clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. He couldn't let this go. Whoever had done this wasn't just tampering with Sophia's grave, they were tampering with the truth. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Mark," he said when his friend answered. "Donald? What's going on?" Mark's voice was concerned. "I need your help," Donald said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "I found something, and I think someone killed Sophia." Mark hesitated. "What are you talking about? What did you find?" I can't explain over the phone, Donald replied. Just meet me at my place. I'll show you everything. As he hung up, Donald stared at the screen again, the image of the shadowy figure etched into his mind. He didn't know who they were yet, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't stop until he found out. Donald Reynolds sat at his desk, staring at the enhanced footage on his laptop. The shadowy figure's face, once obscured by darkness and a hood, was now unmistakable. Donald's breath caught as he recognized the man. "It's him," he whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. "Ethan Clark." Ethan was a senior manager at Sophia's company, someone she had often spoken about. He was charismatic, respected, and had even been invited to their home for dinner on a few occasions. But now, Donald saw him in a completely different light. Determined to uncover the truth, Donald picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Miss Patel," he said when the call connected. "I need your help." Miss Patel was a private investigator he had hired after discovering the footage. She specialized in corporate cases and had a reputation for getting results. "Mr. Reynolds," she replied, her tone brisk. "What have you found?" Donald hesitated, glancing at the frozen image of Ethan's face on his screen. "I know who it is. It's someone from Sophia's workplace, a man named Ethan Clark. He was in her department." There was a pause on the other end. "Ethan Clark?" Miss Patel repeated, her voice sharp. "That's a name I've come across before. Give me a moment to check my files." Donald waited, the silence between them stretching into what felt like hours. Finally, Miss Patel spoke again. "I've got something," she said. "Ethan Clark has been under suspicion for fraudulent activities at the company. Embezzlement, falsifying records, you name it. But no one's ever had enough evidence to pin him down." Donald's heart sank. "Do you think Sophia found out?" "It's possible," Miss Patel said. "If she discovered what he was up to and planned to expose him, he would have had every reason to silence her." Fueled by this new information, Donald dove deeper. He accessed Sophia's laptop, hoping to find clues. As he scrolled through her emails and files, one folder caught his eye: Project Integrity. He clicked on it and found documents, spreadsheets, and emails detailing a massive fraud scheme within her company. The evidence was damning, implicating Ethan and several others. Donald's chest tightened as he read through the files. Sophia had been gathering evidence, preparing to report the fraud to authorities. But she must have known the danger. The late-night calls, the fear in her eyes, it all made sense now. The next step was confronting Ethan. With Miss Patel's help, Donald arranged a meeting at a quiet cafe. Ethan arrived, his usual confident demeanor intact, unaware of what was about to unfold. "Donald," Ethan said, smiling as he sat down. "It's been a while. How are you holding up?" Donald's jaw tightened. "I'm not here to exchange pleasantries, Ethan. I know what you did to Sophia." Ethan's smile faltered. "I'm not sure what you're talking about." Donald pulled out a tablet and played the enhanced footage from the coffin camera. Ethan's face paled as he watched himself digging up the grave and injecting Sophia's lifeless body. "You're sick," Donald said, his voice shaking with rage. "You poisoned her, didn't you? Slowly, over time, so it would look natural. And when that wasn't enough, you tried to tamper with her body to cover your tracks." Ethan's hands trembled as he tried to compose himself. You have no proof," he stammered. Donald leaned forward, his eyes burning with fury. "I have everything. The footage, the evidence Sophia gathered about your fraud. It's over, Ethan." The confrontation ended with Ethan storming out, but it didn't matter. Donald immediately handed all the evidence, Sophia's files, the footage, and Miss Patel's findings, over to the authorities. Weeks later, Ethan was arrested, along with several other individuals involved in the fraud scheme. The investigation revealed the full extent of their crimes, including their plot to silence Sophia. Though justice was served, Donald's heart remained heavy. He had uncovered the truth, but it couldn't bring Sophia back. The house felt emptier than ever, filled with reminders of the life they had planned together. One evening, as he sat in Sophia's favorite chair, Donald thought about her bravery. Despite knowing the risks, she had tried to do the right thing. Her courage inspired him. "I won't let her story end here," Donald said to himself. He began planning a foundation in her name, dedicated to protecting whistleblowers and exposing corruption. The Sophia Reynolds Foundation would provide legal and financial support to those who risked their lives to reveal the truth. Months later, at the foundation's opening ceremony, Donald stood before a crowd of supporters and journalists. A portrait of Sophia hung behind him, her warm smile a reminder of why he was doing this. "Sophia was more than the love of my life," Donald said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "She was a fighter, someone who believed in justice even when it put her in danger. This foundation is her legacy. Through it, we will ensure that no one has to face what she did alone." The crowd erupted into applause, but Donald's mind was elsewhere. He looked up at Sophia's portrait, a bittersweet smile on his lips. "I hope you're proud," he whispered. Though he could never bring her back, Donald found solace in knowing her story would inspire and protect others. The camera in the coffin had not only exposed the truth but had also given him a way to honor Sophia's bravery and ensure her light continued to shine.